Thanks, everyone. All right, my name is Lauren Anderson, and I am the Climate Forest Program Manager with Oregon Wild. My work is focused on protecting Oregon's mature and old-growth forests. Oregon Wild is one of our country's oldest state-based conservation organizations. We've been protecting Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters for over 50 years now. So for this panel today, I'll be setting the stage, introducing our panelists, and offering some closing thoughts at the end of the panel. So let's dive in. It's a fair assessment to say that the current administration has surpassed the worst fears of the conservation community. The Trump administration has rewritten the rule book when it comes to destructive environmental actions and is attempting to undo 50 years of progress on public lands conservation. However, it's important for the conservation community to remember that we were built for this. The laws, institutions, and non-governmental organizations that made the conservation movement in the 60s and 70s were created to confront worse threats than the Trump administration. Rivers were catching on fire, the last old-growth trees were being sent to the mills, and salmon populations were crashing. 50 years ago, we created a backstop to the destruction and held the line, but it's also important to remember that we did more than just hold the line. We translated those environmental impacts into transformational changes in how public lands in this country are managed. Now it's time to remember our roots and hold the line again. Many folks in this room are doing exactly that. And it's time to start getting serious about planning for the transformational changes for the next generation. This panel will explore a brief history of our country's biggest public lands agencies, BLM, Forest Service, with Professor John Leshy. And our other panelists will take a deep dive into examining some of the biggest flaws in the current system of US public lands management, because in order to fix the system, we first need to understand how it's broken, with the hope that we can plan for our future and change some of this. So introducing our panelists. John Leshy is a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of California, College of Law, San Francisco, California. He's the author of Our Common Ground, a comprehensive political history of public lands management in the United States. He was also solicitor for the Department of Interior throughout the Clinton administration. And before that, he was special counsel, chair of Natural Resources Committee. He was also our keynote speaker just before this panel, so he had a longer introduction then, so we could take up the rest of this panel with his accomplishments. But Garett Rose is senior attorney with the Nature Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Garett leads NRDC's work involving federal forest lands and previously worked to defend Alaska's Arctic landscapes. Prior to joining NRDC, Garett worked at a law firm in Washington, D.C., where he represented local conservation groups and scientists to restore the boundaries of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. Sam Evans is senior attorney and leader of the National Forest and Parks Program with Southern Environmental Law Center. Since joining SELC in 2011, Sam has become a leading voice on legal and policy issues impacting our public lands. He has been actively involved in efforts to protect old-growth forests by advocating for nationwide federal protections while fighting and successfully stopping reckless logging projects that put valuable old-growth and national forests on the chopping block. Kristen Boyles, who just got an award right before this panel as well, is managing attorney of Earth Justice's Northwest Regional Office. For over 30 years, Kristen has worked on public lands and wildlife issues, including defending our old-growth forests here in the Pacific Northwest, protecting our wildlife, owls, murrelets, and protecting salmon of the Columbia and Klamath River basins, and fighting the National Roadless Rule, another panel she was just on. Dr. Angela Sondenaa was supposed to join us for this panel. She is a certified senior ecologist and the Natural Resources Director of the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Angela, unfortunately, had a last-minute conflict that came up and prevented her from joining today. She was planning to highlight the exclusion of tribes and indigenous knowledge from the management of public lands as an example of a deep flaw within the current system. And she was going to offer a vision for the future that includes co-stewardship of public lands and points to a need for a new model of doing business that might require considering and integrating some of the old ways first. We'll miss Angela's wisdom in this presentation, but I hope that along with the other 4 flaws that we're discussing today, folks will consider the exclusion of tribes from public lands management as a deep flaw that needs to be addressed going forward. All right, and with that, I am going to hand things over to John Leshy to give an overview of the history of Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service to kick us off.
Oh, good. Well, I've already talked for a long time, so I'm just going to take a very few minutes. I'm going to talk specifically about the Forest Service and the BLM history in terms of public land management and how that has played out. And I should first say, and I'm sure you all know this, but just in case, Oregon has 61 million acres. About a little over half is public land managed by the federal agencies, and the vast majority of that is Forest Service and BLM. BLM, I think, is about 16 million acres of Oregon, 245 million acres nationwide. Forest Service, about the same, 16 million acres in Oregon, a little less, 193 million acres nationwide. Much of that, particularly the BLM land, is scattered all over the state. So is the Forest Service to some extent. Forest Service a little more in the Cascades. But a really wide variety of lands managed by those 2 agencies. Their histories, as you probably know, are somewhat different. The Forest Service was actually, in many respects, the first federal land management agency. It originated in the Interior Department in the 1890s, and then, thanks to Gifford Pinchot and Theodore Roosevelt, was moved to the Agriculture Department in 1905, and that was where it's remained ever since. So the other 3 agencies are all in the Interior Department, and the Forest Service is in the Agriculture Department, and that has actually many ramifications, particularly for those of us who spend a lot of time in the Interior Department and know something about the history of federal lands. One of the driving themes, I think it's fair to say, ever since 1905, is that the advocates of the Interior Department managing agencies want to get the Forest Service back into Interior and maybe into a Department of Natural Resources that would manage all the lands in one cabinet department. And of course, the Forest Service and its many sympathizers want to stay intact, separate, over in the Agriculture Department. And one of the strong implications of that politically is that they respond largely to separate committees in the Congress, and that makes a big difference. And it also means, frankly, that the advocates for consolidation in a single department face very long odds doing that, because the agriculture committees in Congress don't want to give up a huge amount of their jurisdiction to the Interior Department. When I became solicitor back in 1992, Bruce Babbitt called me about it, and we talked, and he said, look, one of the things I want to do as secretary is I want to get the Forest Service back, and I want to consolidate everything in the Interior Department. And I had just finished reading, when he had called, just finished reading this 900-page biography of Harold Ickes, who was the longest-serving Interior Secretary, 13 and a half years. And Ickes, one thing that's abundantly clear in this biography is Ickes spent literally every day as Secretary of the Interior plotting to get the Forest Service back, and he always failed. And one reason he failed, because the committee structure in Congress. And Franklin Roosevelt, his boss, the president, was a very shrewd guy. And Roosevelt knew that was going to be very hard to do, although he had the authority at that time to do it. So what he did was he played Ickes like a drum. I mean, anytime he wanted Ickes to do something, particularly something, distasteful or distracting or whatever, he would say, look, Harold, you take care of this for me, and then let's talk about, creating this Interior Department, giving the Forest Service back to you. And Ickes would run off and do the thing and then come back laughing to Roosevelt and say, I did it, now can we talk? And Roosevelt would say, actually something else has come up. You need to take care of this first. And he did that for 12 years. And Nikki's never got it back. I told Babbitt this story, and I said, do not think about doing this. You're just going to waste your time, and it's going to be a terrible distraction. Read this book. He read the book, and he never mentioned it again. So that's a little background on the Forest Service and the Interior Department. So the Forest Service became the first real management agency. It was in the Ag Department starting in 1905. And its founding authority, which dated back to 1897, was actually very kind of vague and flabby in terms of what it was supposed to do. It talked about securing favorable conditions of water flows and that kind of thing, but had nothing specific in it, nothing multiple use. Those words weren't mentioned. Recreation wasn't mentioned. Ranching, livestock grazing was not mentioned. It's not even mentioned in the 1897 Act. But that was a large part of what the Forest Service did and still does, is supervise livestock grazing. So the modern Forest Service, one could say, came about in 1960 in the so-called Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which Congress passed, which was what it was already doing. And the Forest Service actually promoted that act as kind of defensive because people were trying to take little bites out of the Forest Service, and it said, well, we do all those things now, let's put that in legislation. And it drafted this vague Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which has remained in effect ever since. One other thing that distinguishes the Forest Service and the BLM is that it also came to acquire millions and millions of acres of land outside the West. So that the forests that you see, the federal lands you see in the eastern, midwestern and eastern southern parts of the United States, mostly Forest Service land, all acquired from willing sellers by the federal government, mostly private owners, acquired from willing sellers to create these eastern, midwestern national forests. It was a grassroots thing. Congress authorized it in 1911. Whereas BLM has a quite different history because it didn't exist officially until 1946. Until 1935, all of the what color are they? I guess they're the colors change on the map. It's kind of a red, yeah. There are almost no BLM lands east of the West, east of the Mississippi. The BLM lands were called the lands no one wanted. Because all the other lands were taken up by these other agencies or by railroads and homesteaders and all of that. It was never actually true. The BLM lands were always wanted. They were wanted particularly by ranchers, by livestock grazers. They just didn't want title. Whoops. They wanted the right to continue to graze their cows there, but they didn't want title. They were happy to have title remain in the federal government. So in 1935, Congress passed a law, 1934, Congress passed a law that for the first time authorized livestock grazing on federal lands. It had taken place for many, many decades, but had never actually been legally recognized until 1934 in something called the Taylor Grazing Act. And then the Interior Department established the Grazing Service to manage those lands. And then in 1946, it merged the Grazing Service with the General Land Office, which had not managed, but had been custodian of all the federal lands since 1812. They were merged into something called the BLM. The BLM didn't officially come into being until 1946. So a big, long history of difference. But then, in 1976, Congress passed something called the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which created a multiple-use regime for the BLM that was quite similar to the Forest Service's Multiple-Use and Sustained Yield Act. So over the years, these two agencies have gradually come to do something quite similar under legal authorities that are quite similar. Not exact by any means. They're not perfectly synchronous, but very similar. And they've ended up in somewhat the same place. Now, stepping back a bit and I'll close with this, all four of these management agencies, I think it's fair to say, from the very big picture, 60,000-foot point of view, pretty much manage lands in very similar ways, serving the interests of conservation, protection, and recreation as a primary use of all of those lands. With some differences, obviously. No mining on refuge lands, no mining on Park Service lands, relatively little mining on Forest Service lands, but all of these lands are managed in very similar ways, and generally speaking. And that means that the distinctions among these agencies has been quite blurred over the years. And that's important to understand, too, that most people, I think, on the street, when you talk about federal lands, public lands, they think of their particular tract in their area, and they don't think about whether it's labeled forest or BLM or a conservation area or a park or a monument or a recreation area. These labels are all used by all of these agencies, but they're all managing the lands in very similar ways. So it's been a kind of a blurring of the agency missions. And one of the most important, I would say, in the last 25, 30 years, the two most important things where public land management writ large has changed has been, number one, and I mentioned this in my keynote, the rise of influence of Native American interests in those lands. Didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. Public lands were managed. Tribal interests were off to the side. Nobody really paid much attention to them. Now they are an integral part of consideration of almost all management of all federal lands. The second big difference in the last 25, 30 years has been the rise of BLM as a conservation agency. It now has a separate category of lands called conservation lands that Congress recognized in 2009 and now has about, I think, 38, 40 million acres of BLM lands are actually in this official National Conservation Lands strategy. So that's been a big change too. But all of these lands are, generally speaking, open to all, heavily used for recreation, among other things. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, John. After that, I will hand it over to Garett.
Hello, so I'm going to pick up sort of where John left off. I'm going to go into a deeper dive with the multiple use mandate itself, which is up there. There's no need to memorize it, obviously. It's just to give you a sense of what it looks like and where it is incorporated into the three laws John mentioned. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act at the top, the sort of core articulation of the mandate. The National Forest Management Act of 1976 is the second one, and the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, FLPMA, is the third one, the BLM Act. The point of this talk is to not go into every element of the multiple use mandate. We could talk about that for hours. It's to go into a few observations I've had over the years about some of the flaws with the current, the way the mandate is currently articulated, and think about how it interacts with the systems at the forest, mostly the Forest Service, because that's what I focus on. But I think it also generally applies to the Bureau of Land Management for the reasons John stated. Those two agencies have sort of become more similar over the years. Could you go to slide 2? I'm going to talk a little bit about some key points that have arisen for me about the multiple use mandate, trying to do it in plain English. The first and maybe most important thing is that the mandate places a vast amount of discretion in the hands of the agencies. There are few, if any, substantive guardrails written into that particular language that operate on how the agencies can engage in management of federal lands. Most of the guardrails on agencies' management come from other sources, other laws like the Endangered Species Act, NEPA, regulations like the roadless rule in the context of the Forest Service. That's where the kind of channelization of that discretion comes from, not from the mandate itself. It does raise the question of what guides the agency in the exercise of that discretion. I mentioned a few sort of other legal sources. In addition to that, that's what the planning regime was designed to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is in a few minutes, but on the last slide, the other two laws, NIFMA, the National Forest Management Act, and FLIPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, laid out management regimes, or planning regimes, planning for management for the BLM and the Forest Service. Agency actions are also governed, the discretion is also governed by a slew of regulations, guidance documents, handbooks, and other errata. That sort of, there's an ecosystem of documents that shape and ideally channel how the agency exercises its discretion under the mandate, but the mandate itself, as I mentioned, is extremely broad. Can you go to slide 3? This point is, this slide and what I'm going to say is a little redundant with what John talked about, so I'll try to be brief about it. The story of multiple use is complex. As John sort of alluded to, it goes back to the early days of the Forest Service and evolved over time into the multiple use ideal. Even before MUSIA, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, the Forest Service wasn't just sitting there, they were managing forests, and they developed this multiple use sustained yield approach to forest management over the course of the early 20th century. And as John said, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, was designed to codify that approach to management, that model of discretion. You could imagine Congress in 1960 saying, all right, this isn't working so well, let's revamp the system, let's do something different. They didn't take that path. Instead, they worked with the Forest Service, and the Forest Service wrote most of the mandate to, as I say, codify the agency's existing practice. And it was motivated in large part by fear on the part of the Forest Service that the National Park Service was kind of nibbling away at the National Forest System. And so the Forest Service wanted to, and again, I realize this is a little redundant with what John said, but the Forest Service wanted to emphasize that we too can manage for recreation. You don't have to, Congress, you don't have to give away things to the Park Service, because we can do that. So it's, the point of this history to me, other than just I find it interesting, is that it emphasizes that the mandate was not designed as a course correction. You can imagine Congress doing that. It was a way of saying Congress sort of solidifying the Forest Service's approach to national forest management. And then that later got sort of incorporated into the Bureau of Land Management's Organic Act and FLIPMA. Can you go to the next slide? So this is where I talk a little bit about, how this is all supposed to work. And theory and practice diverge pretty sharply in my mind. I'm going to talk a little bit about theory first. And to be clear, this is a highly sort of idealized, sketched out version. This is another area where we could talk in great detail about how the agency is both supposed to implement its mandate and planning regime and how it actually does. Ideally, the agencies implement the mandate via a pretty extensive planning process. They develop these large-scale land management plans that apply to large parcels of lands, like forest, national forest, or connected units of national forest. And those plans, in the Forest Service's context, they're ideally designed to last for 15 years. They set out the framework for management of the forest for that block of time, and they lay out a pretty generalized framework. And then that's subject to public review, public comment. It's embodied in an ideally a very robust analytic document. And then on-the-ground projects sort of flow from that planning document, and the agency engages in site-specific projects via a subsequent analytic process involving public comment and review in many cases that, again, is sort of framed by the larger framework. Again, this is a very idealized picture. And I think that, like I said earlier, theory diverges from practice pretty sharply. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. And I think one of the reasons, and I think Sam is going to get a little bit more into the divergence of theory and practice on the ground, I think one of the reasons that happens is because that the multiple use mandate has set the agencies up to fail as a structural matter. This is sort of separate from whatever you think of the mandate as it was constructed in 1960, whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. I think that's a separate conversation. But there's a now in 2026, the multiple use mandate, as I said, I feel like the way it's currently constructed sets the agencies up to fail. Among other things, it asks them to do the impossible. You look at the language, it's a task that no agency, no matter how well resourced, could accomplish. And the agency needs to consider the needs of the American people, all the American people. It needs to consider an unconstrained list of uses. It needs to consider various temporal frames, past, present, and future, and so on. It's just it's a laundry list of like, I'm trying to think of a good analogy and I can't, but impossible tasks. And another way in which the mandate sets it up to fail is sort of counterintuitive. In granting the agencies this sort of vast amount of discretion, it simultaneously, I think, pushes the agencies towards a path dependence by providing them with no guidance on how to exercise that discretion. Congress has sort of channeled them towards their at least in the case of the Forest Service, their pre-existing models of discretion. And it has encouraged them via the sort of structure of this mandate to focus a fair amount of their energy on preventing that discretion from being taken away. So rather than sinking resources and time and energy into thinking about innovative ways of improving management, of updating management to deal with the issues that affect public lands today, like, for example, cross-jurisdictional ecological issues like climate change and wildfire, the agency tends towards this path dependency that's rooted in this pre-1960s model of discretion, and it is disincentivized, or it's rather incentivized to focus on protecting that discretion rather than innovating around management. And the last thing I note, and that Sam is going to talk about this more than I will, is that that misalignment that's created by the multiple use mandate exacerbates other misaligned incentives that the agency is subject to. So it creates this sort of vicious cycle that undermines effective and necessary management of the federal lands, at least the Forest Service and BLM lands. Again, I'm not really talking about the Park Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service. The very last thing I'll say, which is, it's not a footnote, but it's more of something I want folks to think about, and then I'll hand it over to Sam, is the role of science at the agency. One might think that the scientific disciplines kind of create this pressure on discretion, that the use of scientific research by the agency should channel the exercise of discretion in the right way. It's sort of a version of saying, if the agency follows the science, we'll all be in a good place. I think a couple points push against that. First is that researchers and scientists are not always well placed to influence agency decision making, and even if they are, it changes over time. Like the Forest Service, for example, has a very robust research branch that does extremely good work. But they're not always the ones shaping decisions, and that can change depending on who's in charge of the Forest Service, who's in charge of USDA. And right now, under this administration, the research branch has been hit hard in terms of staffing and funding cuts. And the other point I'd make about scientific disciplines is that scientific disciplines are not a monolith. I know this is certainly a pathology among lawyers, but there's a tendency to think of science like with the capital S and an exclamation point at the end, science, as this sort of thing out there that you just listen to it and it'll tell you what to do. But scientific disciplines are bodies of practitioners themselves. They have internal conflicts, they have external conflicts, they don't always agree with each other, and the body of science can be, on certain issues, ambiguous, particularly in forest ecology, ambiguous in ways that policymakers then need to interpret. Unlike climate change writ large, there are many management issues where scientific research does not provide a clear-cut, no pun intended, answer. So I think the short version of that is hoping for scientific disciplines or incorporating science into the planning process and land management process is absolutely necessary, like critical. It's not going to solve the problems of the current iteration of the multiple use mandate that I pointed to. It's not a panacea for the agency's ills. That's going to come from thinking about how to restructure the sort of core of the foundation of the agency's legal mandates, among other things. So that's all I've got.
I'm going to use the podium because I want to be able to see my slides. So I started at the Southern Environmental Law Center about 14 years ago. At that time, it was a period of collaboration. So this was an era that lasted, I would say, from around 2000 to 2015 in my region. It was a time when the Forest Service really believed it needed the buy-in of environmental groups. And it came on the heels of our own version of the timber wars. Our timber wars were not like yours out here, but we had some. We had mass mobilization of citizens who were trying to push for an end to clear cutting. And we're in a lot of places in pockets fairly successful. I think around the same time that the owl cases were percolating, we were sending our marquee forest plan up to the chief's office for an appeal process that resulted in a pretty sharp reprimand to the Forest Service in my region, and a do-over that resulted in a pretty fairly modern forest plan around the same time as the Northwest Forest Plan was getting off the ground. So we've been on parallel tracks in that way a little bit. And so around 2000, I think, is when we finally really sort of formally started moving into that period of collaboration. I remember a lot of this, I think, had to do with the fact that the Forest Service was still scared of us. I remember at one point during that period, a colleague of mine, Amelia, sent a FOIA request to the Cherokee National Forest. And she was asking for information about listed species in connection with a project that was going on at the time. And she got a call from the forest supervisor like 2 days later. And he said, "My staff tell me that you're trying to put them in jail for Section 9 violations. Are you trying to put my staff in jail?" And Amelia says, no, it really just is a FOIA request. And that project, although it got off to a rocky start, ended up with a very collaborative solution. With a collaborative group that formed around recreation trails, a severe downscaling of the commercial timber that was originally being proposed. So for a long time, we were really successful in persuading the agency to do things differently, to drop stands that were in places that we were really worried about. It was a time when we weren't filing many cases because we didn't need to. That changed for me around 2015. Shortly after the George Washington Forest Plan, another really successful collaborative process was finished. I encountered, when the Forest Service started the Nantahala-Pisgah Plan revision, a very different agency, one that was very intent on maintaining its discretion at the expense of buy-in from environmental groups. And that sort of manifested in the agency doubling down on really harmful projects, sort of cutting old growth forests to spite us during the forest planning process, and refusing to adopt collaborative recommendations, consensus collaborative recommendations from a group that included the entire swath of stakeholders, from the timber industry to conservation groups. And instead, they sort of cherry-picked those recommendations for the things that were friendly to their own discretion and were friendly to industry and game wildlife groups, but left all of the conservation groups' needs on the cutting room floor. Throughout all this time, the laws had not changed. So we started to do some soul searching and think about what are those other mechanisms that are causing the Forest Service to make these decisions. Like what, especially as we got into the first Trump administration, it would have been very easy just to say, well, it's a bad administration and things are going the wrong direction because of that. But things didn't really change during the Biden administration for us locally. So we really have been looking really hard to find what those mechanisms are that are actually driving agency behavior. It's easy as a lawyer to think like, oh, the law drives behavior, but it's more than that, because again, like the law hadn't been changing. So I'll pick up where Garett left off with the multiple use mandate, and he covered this really well, but I love this quote that the mandate breathes discretion at every pore. And so our question at SCLC has been like, how in the forge of that, in the furnace of that discretion, what is being forged? So what is being measured is another way we've asked that question. Everybody knows what gets measured gets done. So we started to look at the Forest Service's KPIs, its key performance indicators. And the KPIs, the formatting has gotten a little wonky here. I'm trying to show a connection between the the key performance indicators and the multiple uses themselves. What I think the main takeaway first here is that there are fewer yellow arrows than you might expect. The KPIs actually don't do a great job of corresponding strongly to the multiple uses themselves. For example, there is no KPI that corresponds at all to wilderness. Are we doing a good job at maintaining, stewarding the wilderness values in the National Wilderness Preservation System? Who knows? We're not measuring it. It's not one of the drivers for action. I think the other takeaway, which I'll dig into a little bit more, is that the key performance indicators that we do have, most of them are not effective. And for level setting here, when I say effective, I mean, are they changing behavior? Can they provide feedback in a system that changes a line officer's decisions? So I'll start with the key performance indicators that are theoretically at least outcome-based measures. And our community has been asking the Forest Service for a long time to move toward outcome-based measures in contrast to output measures. So timber volume is sort of the classic example of an output measure. It's a commodity measure. These are supposed to measure, is the land getting healthier, right? So the problem with these outcome measures is they're not actually working all that well. They often rely on local monitoring that's not happening. For example, wildfire risk mitigation. Are we actually lowering risk for wildfire in the acres that are being treated? Nobody really knows how many of those acres are getting the follow-up prescribed fire that they need to actually, finish a treatment. Watershed condition framework is similar. Is the Forest Service actually going out and looking at the neglected roads that may be causing risk in watersheds? There's a big gap between the data that we need to answer these questions and the measures that we're saying we're tracking. There's also a lot of time lag. I think the terrestrial condition assessment is a really important example of an outcome-based measure that's just not working. This is instead of relying on local measures, it attempts to use national metrics to figure out whether percentages of land are moving in one direction or another by measures of ecological integrity. But there's so much time between a district ranger making a decision and effects accumulating on the ground from multiple projects with enough significance that it's able to be picked up by these metrics, that there's really no feedback into the process. By then, that district ranger has been promoted 3 times to 3 different forests, has made 100 other decisions. There's not a working feedback loop. There's also a lot of noise and very little signal. These metrics that the TCA is based on, if you have drought stress from climate change, bark beetle infestation, wildfire, those can overwhelm any feedback that you're getting actually on a district ranger's decision. So not working. Some of the other measures are really disconnected from the actual work that is happening. Articles published, it's very important. Research is important, but how meaningful a measure is this when district rangers aren't even aware of the research that the research stations are publishing? Private acres protected, also so important, but it's really only a measure of what budget did the Forest Service get that year for land acquisitions. There's a long queue of lands that are ready to be brought onto the system. And really that's all that's telling us is how much money did we get that year. So it's not changing behavior in any way. The 2 that change behavior are the flagship targets. So timber volume and to a lesser extent, hazardous fuels acres treated. These don't have those same problems that the other key performance indicators do. So these are tied to most or all employees' responsibilities. They're tracked religiously for every unit every year. They provide immediate feedback on performance, and they are unambiguous. There's no noise. It's all signal. Did you get your volume done? Yes, yes or no. It's really that simple. A quick slide on how timber targets work. So there's a national timber target that the Forest Service sets every year. It gets divided into regional targets, which get divided into forest level targets. And then those forests, each of them, in coordination with their district rangers, put together a suite of projects that and do work planning several years out usually and say, okay, these are our projects. How much timber volume are we going to get from the Citigo Creek project? How much volume are we going to get from the Mossy Oak project? And so they plan these projects so that they can put timber on the shelf. That is the part of the process that we're most often engaged with. We're commenting on these projects. We're objecting to decisions. Sometimes we're litigating. But when those timber projects get put on the shelf, the process is not over for the Forest Service. They still have to decide every year how much timber to take off of the shelf and sell in timber sales in order to contribute their share of the timber target. And so if every forest does its job and pulls enough timber off the shelf, it feeds back up, everybody works together, and we meet the target. I think a few things about timber targets that I'll kind of move through pretty quickly. They are mandatory. At every stage, those assigned targets are mandatory under the Forest Service handbook and manual. And they're mandatory not only in sort of theory or in policy, they're mandatory in practice. They're used as elements of performance review. We've done a lot of FOIA practice to find out like what the Forest Service internally is saying about how timber targets affect its own behavior, and it is consistent across the board. These are really, really important. I'll show a couple of graphs. So this one, the blue lines are the timber target, and the red lines are the actual timber sold. So this is at the regional level for Region 9. This is the Francis Marion National Forest. And I share these just as an illustration of the tight correspondence between the target and the actual volume sold. This is exactly what you would expect when a target is mandatory. The Forest Service is not always meeting it, but it is doing its dead level best to meet it. And those FOIA responses that I talked about, they show that timber targets are always at the forefront. They are the #1 priority. They are so important that they displace other goals like health and safety, basic maintenance, keeping trails open, responding to catastrophic disturbance events. They put those things, the things that rhetorically they say are so important, to the side when it's time to meet the timber targets. And timber targets are climbing, with the exception of a pretty significant correction during COVID, which also corresponded to the Biden administration. It sort of lasted through the Biden administration. Timber targets have been climbing, and they are going to climb again. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act mandates targets to climb over the next 9 years. So in 2034, they would be, if the Forest Service meets them, over 5 billion board feet per year. That volume is going to come from the timber baskets of the forest, regions 6, 8, and 9. I'll speed through this part. You can tell why. The timber is going to come from region 6, 8, and 9. They are the green places. They've grown the big trees. And also like to, for folks who aren't as familiar with our eastern forest issues, I like to illustrate that there's a lot of pressure per acre on the eastern forest. We have fewer acres total. And so the volume per acre that comes off of the eastern forest is really high. All right, so I think to sum up basically everything so far, timber targets are causing the Forest Service to do stupid things in stupid places. They are driving it to look for opportunities to get volume out rather than looking for and being led by ecological needs. And there are no countervailing performance indicators that are able to correct that behavior. The same is really true for fuels. A lot of fuels treatment happen in the Southeast. A lot of it is forced into ecosystems where it doesn't belong. This is the cow knob salamander, something that we're looking into right now because the Forest Service is burning up its wet little leaf litter homes. And they're doing that because it is a low-risk place to put prescribed fire on the ground. It can do it year after year after year without having to worry about whether drought conditions will make that unsafe. This is my last slide. So I wanted to kind of think about what all this means. So if the Forest Service is being led to do stupid things in stupid places by stupid targets, that is going to create conflict. So the Forest Service is doing harmful things. Harmful things lead to conflict because it is our job to tell them not to do those things and to try to keep them from doing it, either through persuasion when we can or through litigation when we can't. And when timber targets are low, there's slack in the system. We're able to persuade often when there is room to negotiate. But when timber targets are going up, When the Forest Service is struggling to put timber on the shelf as fast as it is taking it off, there is much less room for negotiation, and conflicts become intractable. And when conflicts become intractable, the Forest Service has no incentive anymore to daylight them through the NEPA process and try to solve them. If they're not going to be solvable, what are we even doing? So I think a lot of our current problems with the Forest Service cutting out public participation, looking for bypasses and loopholes, is downstream of this dynamic forced by timber targets. This is my last slide. It's not the last thing I wanted to tell you, but this shows a little bit how much of a gloomy Gus I've been lately, is that I forgot to put slides in that talk about solutions. But I think, you know, if timber targets are at the root of the problem, what are we doing to address that root problem? Is there something we can do to tackle them directly? And I think there are going to be a lot of answers, including especially in the policy space. But for now, we've been litigating them. So SELC, Patrick Hunter, my colleague in Asheville, is the mastermind of this case, has brought a case in the district court for DC. And we are challenging in that case the whole column of decision-making, from the national target to the regional target to the forest level target to the individual projects that have been put together to meet those targets. And we're saying that the Forest Service, in none of those final agency actions, has considered the aggregate carbon impacts of this dial, this timber target dial that it turns up and down. We're focused on carbon impacts because the pace of timber sales that is determined by the timber target is really the thing that affects the Forest Service's carbon accounting balance, because the forests are storing carbon every year and they are losing carbon every year where we are cutting them. And it's that pace that really matters for that overall carbon accounting. And the Forest Service really never has thought about that. That case is fully briefed on summary judgment motion. We have already survived a motion to dismiss. The Forest Service argued that it was that the timber targets themselves were not final agency actions. We survived that, and the court agreed with us that they indeed were final agency actions, and so we're waiting on our summary judgment ruling. I'm hopeful that we'll get a good decision and that will put some pressure on fixing these targets, that might make some space for the policy discussions that I hope we'll probably have during the question and answer. But for now, that's all I've got.
I too need to see my slides. The way you say this is, what is it about BLM's forests in Southwest Oregon? We went from a very high level look with Professor Leshy to a very much more of a focused look here at the lands in Southwest Oregon. These are lands that are managed by BLM, not by the Forest Service. They are full of old-growth forests. They are full of species. There is recreational opportunities. They are majestic places. They have always been at the center of the fight here in the Pacific Northwest in the timber wars, and there are only 2.6 million acres of them, which I hesitate to use the word only, but in the broader scheme of the acreage talked about for the Northwest Forest Plan, 2.6 million is not that much, and yet they always are a flashpoint. That is because of a unique history and a set of legal battles. And at the end of today, you all will know about the Oregon and California Land Grant Act of 1937. But before we get there, it's important to remember that these are all stolen lands, that the BLM is only the most recent manager of these lands. Pre-European contact since time immemorial, there are native peoples who have lived here and called it home. Oregon had its own Trail of Tears in 1857 when there was a forced march of many of the bands in this area, including the Umpqua, the Rogue, the Shasta, up to the newly created reservation called the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, which wasn't a thing. That's a made-up thing, but is now that the tribal peoples went there. And And it's not like the history of this land gets a whole lot better, although that is definitely probably the low point. In 19, I have to look, see, get my dates right for my history. Congress passed the Oregon and California Railroad Grant Act in 1866, which was going to give thousands of acres for railroads for each mile of track built to complete a railroad between Portland and San Francisco. The act was quickly amended instead of just to give the land to the railroad, that also required the railroad to sell 160-acre plots to homesteaders along the way. So that is Congress's goal. We're going to have a railroad, and we're going to have people that live out there, white people that live out there. And the Oregon and California Railroad formed, and in 1869 was given 2.6 million acres of land. Remember that number? And almost immediately, there was fraud in this system. What turned out that one of the things the railroads like to do is go find some settlers in the saloons of Portland, and they would get them to say that they were going to be interested in getting some of these lands. So they would deed them the 160-acre lands, then mysteriously that land would go to large corporations and became part and parcel of most of the timber corporate interests at the time. They, in fact, abandoned that scheme at one point, decided we didn't need to sort of play that game, and they just out and out sold the land to the developers because the land was so much more, was worth so much more money as timberland than it was as settlers. It was heavily forested, it was steep, it was remote, it wasn't easily accessed. This was not land that you were going to get a lot of settlers on. And so that's why it was much more valuable to do that way. This continued for a long time. The Oregonian broke the story, the investigative journalism of the Oregonian broke the story in 1904 that about 75% of the land sales under the Oregon, under the, this rule violated law. So most of these land sales were invalid. President Teddy Roosevelt proclaimed that as part of his progressive agenda, he was going to clean up the ONC land fraud mess once and for all. And the way that they did that was in 1916, Congress took the lands back. And the lands, the 2.6 million acres of lands, revested in the federal government as now they get called the ONC Act lands. This is a checkerboard pattern of lands. There's a picture later, but it's what gives the lands in this region the sort of blocks of private land versus public land, because that's the way the 160 acres was gone on both sides of the railroad that was eventually built. There were very little timber revenues that actually happened after 1916, and in fact, to such an extent that the counties, the 18 counties which are around this area, formed a thing called the Association of ONC Act Counties. And in 1920, to sort of say, we need some money from these lands, we should be getting payment in lieu of taxes, 50% of all the timber receipts that happen on the ONC Act lands. So after some amount of controversy, Congress passes the Oregon and California Railroad Grant Land of 1937. And this is almost as long as it is. There's another little bit, but this is almost the extent of it. And I highlighted the language that we'll talk about later, and it's a good demonstration for law students of how very simple words can have incredibly complicated meanings, especially depending on how you look at them. The first thing is the heretofore may or hereafter be classified as timberlands. So that is language is going to talk about what is a timberland on these lands which have timber on them. Second part, shall be managed, permanent forest production. Hugely important, that phrase, permanent forest production. Doesn't say permanent timber production. Said permanent forest production. And the question then, of course, is what is a forest? What are we talking about there? Timber is going to be cut and sold for the principle of sustained yield. This is the first time we have a concept of sustained yield in legislation before we get to FLIPMA or NIFMA, to the Federal Land Policy Management Act and the National Forest Management Act. And then what's the purpose of this timber? The purpose is providing a permanent source of timber supply. That's, we have to take care of the counties, protecting watersheds, regulating stream flow, and contributing to the economic stability of those communities, and providing recreational facilities. I mean, this is your first multiple use law. We think that this, we argue many times that this is the first multiple use law, and in fact, it is the first conservation law. It is supposed to stop all that fraud mess that we just saw. This is to be a law for conservation. This was the course correction that it was meant to be. These are these lands today. You can see where Eugene is there. They are managed by BLM. Since 1916, again, the ONC Act counties get 50% of all timber revenue from those lands to support them. And from 1995 to 2016, these lands were managed under the Northwest Forest Plan, just like the Forest Service lands were in the 19 national forests that are also part of the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, into Northern California ecosystem. But this is more of the history, unfortunately, of the BLM checkerboard lands than we would like to say. Because of the way the statute was written, and because of some court interpretations, there has long been, especially among the timber industry, an idea that, in fact, the ONC Act is not a multiple-use act. It is a timber-dominant act. I should go back to my language. Where's my language? Whoop, there. It is a timber-dominant act. It is talking about timber there. And those other purposes, they don't count. They're not what we're talking about. It's a timber first. So for a long time, I would have died for multiple use. If only we could have some multiple use. Because it was always timber first. The second Bush administration started to revamp the protections and the management of this area by proposing to eliminate basically all old growth and riparian reserves. We can get a lot more timber off of these lands. We can hit those timber targets if we didn't have to care about any of the critters that live there. And they justified that by, again, this timber dominance, that this comes first. That opinion, that position didn't get very far. There's a presidential election in there, and there's all sorts of things that happened that the Obama administration didn't want to go forward with. So the first try of the Western Oregon Plan revisions, which is known by the acronym WOPR, so the first time of the WOPR, just failed. And there was litigation around it and was not allowed to go forward. The second time that the Obama administration did not completely drop this idea. They said, we really need to revamp and revitalize the science here. And so they started on a process that we all called WOPR Junior, which was the Western Oregon Plan revisions that ultimately led to the 2016 resource management plans that we have now. And a lot of the legal fight ended up being about interpretations of that paragraph of the ONC Act that I just put up on the board here. The case that used to be the case that we had to deal with, this preview of coming events, this story ends well. It was the Headwaters case from 1990, where the Ninth Circuit said, yep, timber dominant act. Now, they said it in kind of a strange way, and they said it also acknowledging that there were these other uses, but they did pretty much clearly said, the ONC Act is a timber dominant act. Although they said BLM has lots of discretion, and we do know that the agency likes a lot of discretion. There was then the two cases that followed in time that practically undercut that ruling from the Ninth Circuit. The Portland Audubon Society case said, well, BLM has the discretion with respect to timber volumes and the kind of land management they can do, and they upheld injunctions that were put in place on the lands during the, this is the height of the Spotted Owl injunction period. In Seattle Audubon Society, a year later, the district court is even clearer that BLM must, this is the quote, BLM must fulfill conservation duties imposed by other statutes which include, under the ONC Act, managing timber, protecting watersheds, economic stability, and recreational facilities. So that's the sort of, that's there. And that decision was affirmed without much explanation by the Ninth Circuit. So that's where where things stood when we started to fight about the revisions of the plan, of the plans for these lands in 2016. And then the cases took, and I'll say as an aside, sort of an aside, we ended up challenging a bunch of groups, I know many in this room, challenged the 26 resource management plans, and we lost because it was a discretionary choice. It was BLM had the discretion to do the things that they wanted to do. And then there was a series of cases and challenges to President Obama's expansion of the Cascades Issue National Monument, which I'm watching Dave Willis cringe when I say this. And it was all about whether or not the president could make lands part of a national monument, which were ONC Act lands, which had already been, were already under this timber dominant mandate, and how could those lands be part of a monument? And a lot of people would ask me, but why does anyone care? Why does AFRC care? Why does Murphy Timber Company care about this relatively small expansion of the national monument? And it had very little to do with the national monument and a whole lot to do with the interpretation of the ONC Act, because if they could hold up an interpretation of the ONC Act which said timber first, timber always, timber everywhere, then they were opening up the entire 2.6 million estate, not just the portion that was the expansion of the monument. Amazingly, three cases were ultimately brought, 2 in DC, 1 in Oregon, and then eventually those cases went up to the various appellate courts in the Ninth Circuit and the DC Circuit, both holding that the ONC Act did not just mean timber dominant, that the ONC Act had those other words. Remember, people, turns out judges know how to read these words. And they looked at these words and said, well, what are those words doing there? They're showing what needs to happen. In fact, the first highlighted words the DC Circuit even looked at, they said, there's a pretty good argument that these lands, once they became part of the monument, are no longer classified as timberlands. So that's fine, they're done. We don't even have to count those in the timber targets at all, because those lands are not part of the story. Both opinions talk about the discretion that BLM has to do things it wants to do. And interestingly, during the Trump 1 administration, BLM was defending the monument expansion. The DOJ never switched sides. We intervened as defendant interveners, and we were expecting a flip, and it never happened. And I think, based on almost no evidence, that's because BLM wants as much discretion as possible in every possible place. And so they wanted discretion to be able to say, in some situations we have timber, and some situations we don't. And they didn't want to be bound by this little act of 1937 saying that they couldn't say where they wanted the timber harvest to go. This series of cases also reversed a district court decision that was brought by the timber companies, which found that the 2016 resource management plans allowed for too small of a timber harvest, that their timber targets and their allowable sale quantities per year, annual sale quantities, were too small. And they lost that as well. Again, BLM has discretion to set the targets, the amounts that it needs to do. So this discretion is a very big thing. Sam put up my least favorite quote. I will never quote that in a brief ever, even when it's on my side. So where we stand now is the Oregon and California Lands Act. It does represent multiple uses. It represents permanent forest production, and a forest produces more than just trees. Forest produces healthy watersheds and species that live there. It is supposed to produce community economic stability, and that's not boom and bust, which is the only thing some timber companies think economics is. Watershed protection, recreational facilities. It's no longer a free pass to avoid compliance with the ESA, the Clean Water Act, or the Federal Land Policy Management Act. I think that the DC Circuit Court has made it pretty clear that the BLM's reserves have been, in fact, removed from that permanent forest production mandate, if you're reading forest as just timber, and we're just going to take those lands out of the lands to count for what we have to balance. So all's well. We're, yay, we win. Until about 30 days ago, when BLM announced, lo and behold, that they're going to do a review of the 2016 resource management plans. They need to be changed. They need to increase timber harvest, a return to historic levels. Now, historic levels aren't just, 2016 or 2010. They're the levels from the 1970s and 80s. That's 1 billion board feet a year. When last year from these forest lands came about 250 million. That is a huge return. The only way that they're going to be able to possibly even meet those target numbers is to mandate more aggressive logging of old growth in late successional reserves. Those are the areas reserved by BLM for mature and old growth habitat, and to shrink, and this is the one I'm really worried about, to shrink streamside protections and riparian reserves. They already did that in Whopper Jr. That was one of the things that we complained about at the time. I think they're going to do it more. There's very little mention of the Endangered Species Act in the Federal Register notice saying they're going to undertake a revision, which you are now calling Whopper Treble. But we need a new name, so anybody can think about that. Whopper with cheese. So I think that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to focus on. They, of course, had, as everything in this administration is, scoping comments were due within 30 days. That is a week from now, that date, March 23rd. So there was a gathering at lunch today of people we are hastily putting together comments, trying to hit every single issue. These are scoping comments, and so we don't have really a proposal to respond to. It's just, these are the things the agency should think about as they try to go forward here. The notice also asks for information that the public has on existing or what should be nominated as ACECs, which stands for Areas of Conservation and Critical, everyone together, Areas of Critical Environmental Concern. And so this is also a very, very site-specific place where they're asking for input on what those areas should be. The notice also says that BLM will consult with tribes, but it's I have not done a lot of outreach, but I have not heard of any consultations happening yet with tribal nations in this area. We will still see. This is the schedule that they have up on their e-planning site, which would give us a draft environmental impact statement in June and a final in November. If it's anything like we're hearing on other things, I suspect whatever draft comes out, if there is a public comment period, and that's still a big if, it'll be no more than about 30 days. So this is rocket docket time. And here's how you could submit some comments. There's an e-planning site, there's an email, and then you could do it old-fashioned way by mail. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so as a community, we are definitely facing some of the biggest public lands threats we have faced in decades. And we're facing those threats in the context of many other attacks on our democracy and communities. And so this space right now feels pretty heavy. But we need to remember that the institutions, the norms, the policies that they break are going to create opportunities for us to rewrite our own rule book under the next administration. The real challenge for our community might not only be holding the line against this administration's harmful policies, although clearly there's a lot of need there. We also need a proactive vision for what comes next. We need to ensure this public anger that we're seeing right now in result to the actions of this administration is translated into movement building. Key decision makers need to feel empowered to think big and outside the box. And coalitions need to be ready to seize the moment when that window of opportunity arises. So this is a call to action in addition. to everything else everyone's already doing.